So very, very happy to share my slides. So good morning to all of you. Thank you for dragging yourselves away from, I guess, fika for many of you, to come and listen to me talk about the Global Open Research Commons. So what I'd like to do is really just give you a high-level overview of why we decided to develop this, what it is, where it's being used, and because this is a work in progress, what's coming next. That's my email address. Very happy to answer questions via email. That's my website where you can find out probably more than you would ever want to know about me. And there are quite a lot of links embedded in the presentation. And when you access the slides on Zenodo, you'll be able to follow those links. So I want to talk about why we thought this was a problem that needed to be solved, what we developed, where it's being adopted, and what comes next. And I should start off by saying that all of the work that I'm going to describe was done within the support structures of a thing called the Research Data Alliance. I'm guessing many of you will have heard of this, but for those of you that haven't, this was launched in 2013. I was part of the founding group that set this up. And the vision we had back then was that we wanted people to be able to share and reuse data across a series of boundaries, technology boundaries, discipline boundaries, national boundaries, of course. And so RDA has hosted people within interest groups and working groups to build what we call the social and technical bridges that enable that vision. And so this work that I'm going to show you this morning was done within interest groups and working groups within the Research Data Alliance. And I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Research Data Alliance and their structures for enabling this. So we started, I and a number of other people, and I'll provide links to or pictures of my co-chairs at the end. A number of folks in RDA were seeing an increase in the number of what were being called research data commons. So some of these were national research data commons, some of these were thematic research data commons, and they were being discussed more and more in the latter years of the last decade. And yet we recognize that those national and thematic commons weren't going to be enough to solve some of the really big challenges and the big problems, because you actually need data from a number of different subject domains or a number of different locations. And so the founding impulse was, okay, how do we ensure interoperability across these commons? And I'll return to the question of interoperability at the end. So we started off in 2018 with a Birds of a Feather session in Berlin, and then we formed an interest group, a Research Data Alliance interest group, to provide this sort of neutral space where people could talk about issues that they were seeing arising with respect to what were variously called knowledge commons, open science commons, data commons, research commons. And the long-term goal was that we wanted to develop a roadmap for commons integration. Spoiler alert, we're still working on the roadmap. But that was one of the things that we saw as important at the start. And so to begin with, we thought, well, okay, let's try and understand the space we're working in. So we came up with a definition of the commons. We looked at a range of existing, these research commons that were forming, their architectures, and we developed out of that what we call a typology of essential elements, which is the next slide. And then once we created this, people said, yeah, but what do you mean by this term? And so we came up with a set of definitions for each of those essential elements. And all of that got presented as what's called a supporting output, for reasons I won't bore you with, got some revisions and got accepted as a kind of a published output in August of 2023. So quite a long gestation period, as you'll see, some of which was taken up with RDA processes. There'll be links to the typology in a number of the documents towards the end of the slides. So what is this typology of essential elements? And this is the current published version of the typology, the one that we're referring to. You can see it's version 1.2. You will also see, by the way, that this is licensed as CC BY, so Creative Commons Attribution. For those of you that haven't run into this before, and I'm sure you all have, you're welcome to take this and use it in whatever way seems appropriate to you. So we're not kind of holding on to it. But these were the essential elements. And we abstracted these from looking at the existing commons that were coming into existence. So we looked at them and we said, okay, if you were going to build something like that, what are the essential things you need? And there are 3 different kinds of essential elements. The ones that are across the bottom, the ones in mid-blue, and I confess now, I haven't actually checked to see what this looks like if you're colorblind. My apologies if any of you are colorblind and the distinctions I'm describing don't matter to you. I'll make a note to myself to check that. Anyway, the 3 across the bottom are the ones that are perhaps most familiar to people working in a technology space, building repositories or data stores. So you have on the left, compute, storage, network, access, authentication infrastructures. That's what AI is. So if you like the more technology-focused elements. Down the bottom, you have the research objects, and we deliberately use the word research object because there are many different kinds of outputs from research: publications, data sets, models, workflows, software, and so on. These are all, if you like, research objects produced by the research process. And then services and tools. And so the services and tools run on the compute and storage to let you do things with the research objects. So those are, if you like, the ones that are most familiar. But as we examined these commons that were coming into existence, we realized that that's not enough. There's a whole series of additional elements that you might think of as social elements rather than technical elements that are necessary for commons to succeed. You need people with the right skills. So this is the human capacity hexagon on the left. You need rules about who can use the commons and how people get access to the commons and who's not allowed to use the commons, or the conditions under which people are allowed to use it. So rules of participation and access is what we call that. You need governance structures to make sure that the commons is going to be well organized and well governed. You need to engage with your users, and you need to ensure that the commons is sustainable, because you don't want people starting to have research that depends on access to a commons which goes away when a grant finishes, shall we say. So the social elements were critically important. And then at the center, we said, we're doing this because we need interoperability. And we recognize that in order to make this work, we need standards. And I'll talk later in the slide about how we're rethinking some of these early decisions. But this was the model in 2023, and it's the one that's currently published. So the interest group started first and was, if you like, a synthesis approach, looking at existing examples. And then we realized, well, that's great. That says what is an essential element, but how would you build it? Oh, and I realize now, I can just go back a slide. When I say that these are essential elements, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have something in each of those hexagons, but it does mean that you need to have thought about what you're going to do in each of those hexagons. So you might say, for instance, we are not going to have any rules of participation and access. Anyone can do whatever they want with it. Anyone can access it. But deciding not to have rules of participation and access is a decision. And so you have to at least have thought about each of those. And that's why we call them essential elements. It's essential that you think about them and make a decision about them. So the interest group said, okay, great. but how would you build one of these? And so we spun off a working group, and this is a very familiar RDA pattern. You have an interest group that identifies particular problems that it wants to solve, and it spins off a working group to solve those problems. And so we spun off the GORC International Model Working Group, essentially to do an analysis task of how you would build a commons that was consistent with these essential elements. And this had multiple strands of input into this thing called the international model. Firstly, the typology, the hexagons that I've just shown you. A speaker series. So we had a number of different speakers from a range of different commons and commons-like organizations talking about what they were doing and trying to map it onto the essential elements, onto the typology. We had an extensive literature review, and here I need to acknowledge CJ Woodford, who is responsible for at least some of these slides and did almost all of the work for the literature review. Very, very extensive literature review. And a number of task groups. And all of these strands came together into this thing called the international model. There's a report that I'll link to at the end. And what we produced out of that was this thing called the international model, which is I guess, a first attempt to describe the components of a commons at a more granular level than those very high-level hexagons, the typology of elements. And so the idea behind the model was to help people who were planning to build or operate or use a commons to get a sense of, yeah, great, but if I drill down into each of those essential elements, what's in there? What do I have to do? What are the decisions I have to make? What's the guidance for people that want to do this? And so it's a non-prescriptive guide. When this was created, it was held in a spreadsheet. It's still, the spreadsheet's probably still the version of reference, but I'll show you some other versions in a little while. And it's organized by those essential elements and then broken down into categories and subcategories. There are extended descriptions, there's examples, there's sources, and there's what we call the consideration level, which is if you're going to consider this thing, this subcategory, is it essential? Is it desirable? Is it optional? So to provide some guidance for people. And a glossary explaining what each of those terms means. And there's also an associated report which explains the methodology, how we came up with this international model, as well as a summary of the model in narrative form and some examples of current and intended use of the model. So the typology, the hexagons, and the model are not the same thing. They're related, but they are at different levels of granularity, if you like. So this is an exercise that's been going on for a while. And as a result, we've had a chance to go back and rethink some of the early decisions we make or clarify some of the decisions we make. And in particular, as we engage with people that are adopting it or thinking about adopting it, they've asked questions that have made us go, yeah, maybe we should have thought about that a little bit more carefully. The first thing, and this is not on the slides, this is my personal reflection, is that before you come up with the name of something, you need to think about how people are going to say it. And so GORC, in English at least, doesn't sound particularly pleasant. In fact, to gawk at something in English is to look at something in a sort of over-inquisitive way. My Dutch colleagues find it even more amusing because the initial G in Dutch means that it's pronounced "glok," which sounds even worse. So we probably should have thought about the name, but it's too late. It's escaped. So let's break down each of those individual elements. Global. It's not a single commons to rule them all and in the darkness find them. It's thinking about how you pull together existing commons into something that's more globally interoperable. So it's, if you like, about global collaboration and coordination rather than a single global thing. Open, and I know this is an open science seminar series. One of the pieces of feedback that we've got is, well, open doesn't work for all research. So some of the people that want to adopt this model are working with personally identifiable information or environmentally sensitive information that can't be made fully open. And so here we've adopted a phrase that's used in the Netherlands and also I think in EOSC a bit: as open as possible, as restricted as necessary. So the vision is that things be open, but we recognize that there are certain scenarios where that's not possible or desirable. Research, some people have said to us, well, wait a minute, why isn't it science? There's the UNESCO Open Science recommendation. Why are you talking about research and not science? And the answer is that in some English-speaking countries, mine included, science does not include humanities or social science. And so if you say this is a science commons, people will think about engineering and chemistry and physics and maths and whatever. They won't think about humanities or arts or possibly even social science. And so we deliberately chose to use the word research because science was too restricted. Now, there are languages that avoid this problem by having a single word, Wissenschaft in German, Vetenskap in Swedish, which covers both of those things. Unfortunately, in English, which was the language we were working in, we needed to come up with something that was broader. And so it's a research commons, not a science commons. And it's important to note here that when we say research, we don't just mean the data that comes from research, although that's obviously included. We also mean the data that is used for research, that has not necessarily been generated by researchers. So galleries, libraries, archives, museums in the humanities domain produce data that is used for research. Government departments produce data that gets used for research. Citizen scientists produce data that is used for research, but is not necessarily from research. So it's, when you see the word a research commons, for us, it's data for as well as data from. And lastly, commons. And the commons is explicitly drawing on the work of Elinor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize for her work on what she called common pool resources. But we've adapted that for global collaboration and interoperable infrastructure. She was more focused on more physical geography examples rather than data infrastructures. And so we've sought to broaden that out to consider how her ideas of common pool resources apply to in an infrastructure space. So that's what we have at the moment. We have a topology of essential elements. We have a much more detailed international model. How are people using it? One way is to characterize something that exists already. And so here, EGI, the European Grid Infrastructure, is using the model to think about how it fits into EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, into the new EOSC Federation, and also to think about how that might apply to what they call multi-supply federated environments, where you're bringing together different providers to provide services to users. SURF in the Netherlands is using the model as a reference when they're doing engagement with users and when they're planning the services they're going to provide as part of the Netherlands large-scale research infrastructures, the LSRI. So that's applying it to something that exists already. It's being used also as an analysis tool. So CSC in Finland, and again, SURF in the Netherlands, are part of an early pilot of developing national nodes for the EOSC Federation. And they're using the international model as a way of thinking about how the services that they provide nationally plug into EOSC and the EOSC Federation. So they're examples of what I referred to earlier as national commons. An example of a discipline commons that is using this is a collaboration called PANOSC, which is a group of photon and neutron sources in Europe, which is using the essential elements, again, to consider how they engage with EOSC, but here from the perspective of a discipline provider rather than a national provider. And the Research Data Alliance has got a working group developing a catalogue of requirements for trustworthy technical repository service providers, and they're using the model as a source of attributes for the catalogue that they're developing. Then the last example is for creation, for creating something from scratch. So there's an initiative called the RDA Knowledge Base, where the GORC model is used as an organising ontology. And more familiar to some of you, perhaps, Biofair in the UK put in a successful proposal for a biocommons infrastructure, and they used GORC to structure that proposal. And in fact, they describe that as their North Star for their vision of how they want biocommons to work. We have a range of adoption tools for people that want to adopt. One is the spreadsheet. This is a very small slice of the spreadsheet. All of these, by the way, are linked to the actual thing. When you get the slide, if you click on that, it'll link you to the spreadsheet. It's a very comprehensive spreadsheet, but can be a little bit off-putting and scary for people. So we've also developed what we call a narrative template, which is much more a series of questions and boxes that you can fill in on your own. And lastly, we have a visualization tool with connections to the Data Stewardship Wizard, which some of you may know. And here I need to acknowledge the work of Lars Eklund and the team at NBIS, who did the dev work for this. And realize this is going to be impossible to read, but this is essentially all of the categories and subcategories within the international model connected together so you can zoom in or out or select subsets of them. It's a very nice visualization and way of interacting with the model. So my thanks to the dev team at NBIS that built this, and also support from RDA Tiger, which funded much of that work. As you can imagine from hearing about the GORC approach, you could imagine that there might be interactions with other bits of RDA, and there are indeed. So this is a diagram that shows our way of thinking about interactions between our group and a number of the other groups. And you'll notice that Muldreth, the Muldreth 2 working group at, I don't know, what do you reckon, 1 o'clock on the clock, was the subject of the talk by Rory McNeil, I think in the last one of these seminar series. So we have groups who are coordinating with, in this case, the International Implementation Working Group and the Health Data Commons Profile Working Group. We have groups we're cooperating closely with, and we have groups that we network with. So we've got quite detailed interactions with a whole range of different groups within the Research Data Alliance. So what's coming next? One of the things that we've realized as we engage with adopters and as we think more about the model and as our level of maturity grows is that there's a number of changes that we think we'd like to make. The first of these is that standards is probably too restrictive. And there are, of course, de jure standards, standards that are formally defined. ISO standards is one example of those. But there are also lowercase s standards, ways of working that are developed by individual communities or disciplines, and you might think of them as conventions. And so one of the changes that we're considering is changing standards to standards and conventions. You'll note I haven't talked about interoperability, which is on that middle hexagon. I'll talk more about interoperability on the next slide. So that's one change we're thinking about. The second change we're thinking about is sustainability. That looked like a good idea at the time. It's now problematic for a couple of reasons. One is using the dollar as a symbol of sustainability is not something that I would choose now. So we would want to change that as the very least. But more importantly, sustainability is about more than just money. There are a series of things that play into whether you have a sustainable commons, and simply focusing on do you have funding is too short-sighted. So we're almost certainly going to be changing the sustainability image to look different. And then down here, we have services and tools. And here we've been very much influenced and informed by the work of the Muldroth Group, Rory's talk in the last session of this seminar series, where they have been thinking very hard about how you would zoom in on services and tools. And so one of the ideas that's come out of that is that you probably want to recast services and tools as research enabling services, which probably should live over in compute, storage, network, and AAI, and researcher facing services, which would sit over on the right. And so, again, one of the changes that we're considering quite hard is drawing on the work of the Muldroth Group and refactoring those two essential elements. And obviously this will flow through into version 2 of the model. And so probably sometime next year, there will be a version 2 of the international model, as well as an updated typology of essential elements that will reflect those changes and potentially other things that we think of over the course of the year. So I said I'd come back to interoperability. Interoperability was the original driver, and it's currently at the center, but it's complex. And in particular, you need to think about multiple interoperability dimensions. There's legal interoperability, there is organizational interoperability, there is technical interoperability, there's semantic interoperability. It's not just interoperability. And it's not really an essential element. It's an essential driver for what we want to do, but it's ideally a consequence of using the model. And we've had a long debate over close to a year now about where interoperability should sit. And so one of the ideas that we're playing around with at the moment is that we keep it at the center, but we make it something like interoperability through standards and conventions. So that's not yet a decision, but it's something we're thinking through and may well appear in version 2 of the model, but it will be discussed, made available for community feedback before we do anything. Because one of the things we've recognized is that as more and more people adopt the model, we have to be more careful about how we change it, how we consult around the changes, and indeed how often we change it. So, ongoing activity, second last slide. The interest group will continue. We have a number of task forces and task groups that are thinking through some of these ideas. There's going to be a link there to join us if you're interested. The current International Implementations Working Group is going to complete in October of this year at the next RDA plenary in London. We will probably propose a successor working group, but that's not definite. There's a Horizon Europe call that references the GORC concept, among other things, which is going to fund 2 to 3 projects, probably starting late this year, early next year. So there may well be further work happening within the context of a European Commission-funded project. And as I've said already, version 2 of the model will appear almost certainly in 2027. So let me close by thanking my co-chairs, Javier Lopez Albacete from the European Commission in Belgium, Lautaro Matas from La Referencia, he's in Argentina as well as Spain, Mikiko Tanafuji from NII in Japan, me and CJ Woodford, who did much of that early working group work and was responsible for the bulk of the version 1 of the international model, who's based in the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, in Canada, obviously. I've got links to the documentation on that slide, links to the international model on that slide, and a report from a workshop we held in July of last year in Leiden in the Netherlands at a Lorentz workshop, which goes into a lot more detail about some of the issues that we've discussed and our thinking about how we might go ahead and change things. So I'll stop there and see if people have any questions.
Thank